And welcome everybody to our wonderful event this afternoon, Life of a Grape. This is Crossroads Cultural Center, and before I introduce Jose, who will be leading our panel today, I just wanted to say a few words about what Crossroads Cultural Center is. We are a group of friends who are passionate about culture, in particular the influence of religion on culture. And we are members of the lay Catholic movement, Communion and Liberation. And this is actually our 10th season. 10 years. We started in 2006. I don't know if she's here, Jane Galash. Yeah. But she was our first host for one of our first events that we had here in Washington, D.C. She was a curator at the Renwick. And since that time, we've done more than 60 different events here in Washington, D.C., exploring all of the connections that we can, looking at reality with openness, with positivity, with curiosity, and with critical awareness. So we are so glad to have you here with us, everyone here this evening. Thank you for coming out on this post-Joaquin afternoon. So I'm going to turn the program over to Jose Porro, who will introduce the rest of our guests, and thank you again.
Thank you, Barbara. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. As Barbara already said, my name is Jose Porro, volunteer with Crossroads Cultural Center. Just to kind of follow up on what Barb said, at Crossroads, our goal is to offer opportunities for education, making it possible to look with openness, curiosity, and critical judgment at every aspect of reality. Our ideals are summed up by the suggestion of St. Paul: test everything, retain what is good. Today, instead of test what is good, we're going to say taste what is good. Before we begin our panel discussion, I'd like to take a moment to thank our speakers that will introduce themselves in just a moment. But I also want to say thank you especially to the Darlington House who has hosted us. I don't know if Patty's around. Okay. Lovely area here, so we are very grateful to be here. Gregoire Poirier, sitting right next to me, founder of American Grand Cru, who sponsored the wine that we'll be tasting today. Nuclear Vogue, who has lent us both the monk, Father Placid, and Aimée Sunseri, which is our winemaker from California. I would also like to thank all the volunteers on the Crossroads Committee that helped put this event together, and all those that will be assisting in doing the wine pouring. So, with that out of the way, referring back to the quote from St. Paul today, we are going to test the meaning of wine in our lives. For thousands of years, wine has been a significant part of our lives and can be found in ancient documents and paintings. Just to give you a very small taste, I would like to share just a few quotes. It can be alleviated by good sleep, a bath, and a glass of wine. Thomas Aquinas. Music is the wine which inspires one to new generative processes, and I am Bacchus, who presses out the glorious wines for mankind and makes them spiritually drunken. That's Ludwig van Beethoven. I'd like to start by asking Father Placid to introduce himself and help us understand the history of the region from the Cistercian monk's perspective. Describe this history of the Cistercians and how they developed this tradition of winemaking.
My name is Father Placid, and I'm from the Aimée Nuclear Vogue. When the Cistercians were founded in 1098 from a small monastery called Malem, they wanted to make a more authentic way of life of living the rule of Benedict. Part of what they felt was that when they were given lands, especially in the 12th century, most of these lands were not meant for cultivation. Oftentimes they were donated by lords and other nobles who asked for the monks to pray for them. And part of it was to be given these lands. You know, most of these lands were not meant for cultivation at all. And so when they inspected the land, they had to figure out what to do with this land in order to make them monasteries and also orchards, fields, and ultimately vineyards. Part of what became terroir was the sense of knowing which grapes go with which soil. But this is part of their whole ethos of we glorify God by doing things that need to be done well. And this is also true for their buildings or architecture. And so even when they made grain buildings or barns, they were constructed for not just utility, but for also generations yet to come, for eternity. And so this is why their architecture, especially their churches, in the sense of light, balance, and proportion, gave a sense of a God who is luminous, a God who is with them as they prayed 7 times a day, and also during the night. And so this is the same way in which they did their buildings, even for their labor. So when they came to these plots of land that they didn't know what they were getting themselves into most of the time, this is where they also discovered they needed to drain the lands, because most of the times they were swampy. So they figured out ways in which today we would say they drained off the land to make it more fruitful. And this is part of also their sense of that it's not just for utility and not just for profit, but also for the sense of we're men of God and these are for people of God. And so this is how they realized a way in which through constant trial and error, but a sense of purpose and a sense of we're doing this for God. And they developed also ways in which they made the water go to their monasteries by developing the first hydraulic systems made out of stone. And so they would come up from their rivers or their lakes and go up to the monastery, sometimes 300 or even thousands of yards away. And this is the sense of also what they did for the grape vineyards, realizing that certain grapes do well better on certain lands that were not meant to be cultivated at all, and others could be used for other periods. And so they also did this in a sense of not just for growing wine for profit, but also for mass wine, and also for their own wine, because most of the times during that period, the monasteries were rather large, sometimes up to 800 monks in one monastery, sometimes 600, but most of the labor was done by what they called lay brothers. We don't have a sense of lay brothers today, but there were monks who prayed and there were monks who worked. The ones who prayed were oftentimes from the noble families and from the knightly class. The Cistercians were somewhat revolutionary, and they allowed serfs and non-landowners to become part of the monasteries by becoming lay brothers. The lay brothers were ones who were illiterate, but they prayed 7 times a day and once during the night by their Hail Marys and their Our Fathers. And they worked the land. They were the ones who set up these ranges. These were properties of the monasteries, sometimes 100 miles away from the monasteries, and were the ones who set up the granges, set up the orchards, set up the fields, worked them, and then came back on Saturday and Sundays for Mass on Sunday, and then returned. And this was the sense of everyone is one under God, even in a monastery, and especially in a cloistered monastery. This is the sense of glorifying God with their lives on a daily basis. And also the sense of prayer, and a sense of what to do with certain soil and certain lands was part of the sense of how to understand where they come from, not only by thinking about it, but also the insights they developed from their prayer life, which expanded their sense of it's not just for today, but also for the future. And so this is how these lands eventually, as they became no longer part of the monasteries, but that's another part of history. And this is what was developed in France and became part of the tradition of winemaking that we now know it today.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to invite Aimée Sunseri to tell us a little bit about her experience and maybe follow up on what Father Placid said in terms of how the tradition of winemaking has evolved, specifically in Napa Valley, but maybe you can also compare it to how that compares to Burgundy from the movie and what we saw there.
All right, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank our host and everyone coming here today and inviting us. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity, and we really appreciate it. I work for, just really quickly to give you an idea, we've got 3 different brands of wines that I'm representing today. I actually am a winemaker for 3 brands. I work with the brothers at the Abbey of New Clairvaux in Vina, California. It's about 3 hours north of Napa. I also have the opportunity, I'm a 5th generation winemaker in my family. We stem out of Napa. We still have retained about 85 acres of vineyards there that my father owns. And we bring some of that Napa fruit, we bring it to the monastery in Vina. We process it there. The brothers help me make this wine. And that wine is a featured brand that the brothers and I are partners in. It's the Aimée brand. It's just to give me a platform to help support me in my career and my goals to be a very great a winemaker and try to make something exceptional. And then on top of that, in 2009, my family in Napa, we also have a winery called Nicolini's, and that family has an American legacy. They came originally from Switzerland, from the Ticino region, back in the late 1800s, and homesteaded a piece of property there. They were immigrants, my great-great-grandparents, and started a winery. And it is today the oldest family-owned and operated winery in Napa. And I'm continuing that legacy. They've passed the baton to me in 2009. And I'm the winemaker there as well, and I get to share with you some of those lovely wines with you tonight as well. So, back to your question, Napa and Burgundy. It's very interesting. They are very different places. Burgundy is Pinot Noir country, and they grow other grapes there as well, but that's particularly one of the more famous ones. And Napa, on the other hand, is a little more cab country. And we actually have a cab today that I brought for you to share. A lot of people would say Napa is more akin to Bordeaux, but there is some likenesses as far as weather-wise. It's a little more akin to Bordeaux region. Burgundy is a little bit cooler than Napa is. And but the things that they do share in common would be their sense of place. And this is something that developed, I think, first with Cistercians, with terroir. I think even though the word was not developed yet, the idea had been planted and the seed had been developed. And what it is a sense of place. It's the microclimate, the soils, the variety all those combinations put in a specific site and how that transposes into a wine and what that ends up making. And then changing that combination, you might have the wrong variety on that site, and how that changes, and eventually you get to a place where you say, yes, this was meant to be, and this is a beautiful batch and a beautiful pair. And I think that's what the monks got to. They got to a place where they realized, we'll plant this and try it, and if it didn't work, they moved on and kept experimenting and kept documenting and kept passing on information from generation to generation. And eventually, they found beautiful pairs and matches. And hence in the movie, they talk about Clos des Vougeot, which is a very famous vineyard, probably the most famous vineyard in the world. I believe when I went to UC Davis, I'm a graduate of UC Davis and have a degree in viticulture. We talked about this vineyard. It was a prized vineyard. I was told that at the time, this was in 2003 when I graduated, that there was 150 owners, and it's only about 5 hectares big, which is not very big. And families own single rows. This is how famous it is. And each family farms it a little differently. I can't even imagine farming one row slightly differently than the other row. But that's how prized this vineyard is. And the brothers started that vineyard. And it was in a swampland that needed to be drained just to make it plantable. And that's what the monks did. So anyways, a sense of place. If you go to Burgundy, if you go to Bordeaux, if you go to anywhere in France and you'll notice, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with place names. They'll put the place, not the grape variety, which is a little different than we do in this country. We do respect that idea because we do have, Napa Valley on the bottle. Mostly because of laws. We actually, in America, my family even started with, when they first labeled wines, we had a Burgundy, we had a Chablis, we had a Bordeaux, even though they weren't from those places. It's just because everybody bought wines and that's what they knew, what they liked. Chablis was a little sweet, Burgundy was, a certain style, Bordeaux was another style. And so that's what the consumer really identified with. But France, it was an insult to France because they coveted these places. These were, it would be, I don't know exactly how to make it akin, but it was definitely a very personal thing because they said, no, Burgundy means it's from Burgundy, and this is the place. The place makes the wine. And so through a lot of trade reasons, we developed agreements to be able to trade with France, and we agreed that we would respect their place names. And so we started taking off, it actually became illegal to put, if you were to develop a new label, there are still labels out there that are grandfathered in, but today if you develop a new label, you will not be allowed to use a place name from another region. So that's where varietals came into. People started to say, well, what do we call it? Well, I guess we're going to have to call it Cabernet. I guess we're going to have to call it, and that's where the popularity of varietals came into play. Because when we had Burgundy, we would put whatever grape we wanted to in it. It just needed to be dry. Chablis was the same thing. We put a white grape in it, and it needed to be sweet. There was a typicité of the type of grape that most people use, but really nobody knew, the consumer didn't know what the grape was. So then we move into a time period where we have varietals. I'm getting a little off track, so I'll get back on, but about the sense of place. Burgundy, it's funny, they say we all take, Burgundy wines are all a certain way. And they have a lot of rules and restrictions. They have to plant this type of grape, they have to grow it in this manner, the wine can only be made in this blend, and it needs to be replicated every year, the same every year. We have the luxury of having a little more experimentation in the Americas. We don't have so many rigors, but that also means that our wines can vary a lot more. But in Burgundy, they have, it's funny, they'll say, you know, one place will say that we have different wines than the next, or their neighbors, but they're both in Burgundy. And you'll find the same type of idealism in Napa. Napa has about 16 sub-AVAs. An AVA is an American viticultural area. And Nicolini's, for instance, is in the Chiles Valley. It's an East Foothills appellation that's about 1,000 feet above sea level. And we will say we taste different than the valley floor down in Rutherford. But we're all Napa. And so the idea of terroir is actually a lot more of a microclimate and a micro idea. You can be 5 miles apart, you can be a road apart and still be different. So anyways, it's a tough thing to understand, but when you get out in the field and you actually walk the vineyard and you walk upon a spot that's rockier than two rows away, you will notice that you can make a very different wine from that, and that is the thing that the monks were noticing about the terroir.
Thank you.